An elderly black man was forced out of a front seat on a bus, not realizing he owned the entire company. This incident marked the beginning of events that would change the lives of both the driver and Mark Harrison himself. What happened next would shock even the most seasoned. But let's start from the beginning. Mark Harrison, an elderly black man with gray hair and a confident posture, boarded the bus to spend the day as usual. Despite being the owner of this transport company, Mark always liked to check on operations firsthand. He believed it was important to personally observe how employees behaved and how customers used his services. The bus was half empty, with several seats available up front. Without hesitation, Mark made his way to one of them, but as he approached, he heard the cold voice of the driver. "Hey, old man, you're going the wrong way. These seats aren't for you. Sit in the back." Mark froze in place. The driver, a white man with a cocky expression, kept glaring at him. Mark didn't immediately understand what was happening. He often rode his buses, and such situations were rare. Inside the bus, silence fell. Passengers who had been engrossed in their own activities started paying close attention. "Excuse me, but is there a problem with where I want to sit?" Mark asked calmly, trying to suppress the rising anger. "Didn't you hear me the first time?" The driver slammed his hand on the steering wheel in irritation. "I said go to the back. These seats aren't for people like you." Now Mark understood everything. This wasn't just an incident, not merely random rudeness. It was blatant discrimination, laced with contempt. He looked into the driver's eyes and saw the familiar cruelty and prejudice with which he likely treated many people who shared Mark's skin color. Mark could have said everything he thought. He could have immediately revealed his identity and explained that the driver was speaking to the owner of the entire company. But he knew situations like this required a delicate approach. It was important not to lose control in anger, so as not to give further reason for insult. He slowly nodded, without saying another word, and walked to the back of the bus. As he made his way there, the passengers' eyes followed him. Some turned away, pretending nothing was happening, while others watched with interest. However, no one stood up to defend Mark. This was the essence of it all. Silent complicity that allowed such things to happen over and over again. Sitting in the last seat, Mark took a deep breath, trying to calm down. Over the years, he had encountered this many times. He had lived through times when such scenes were common, when the color of your skin dictated everything, from your rights to how people treated you on the streets, in restaurants, and at work. But now it was a different time, and such behavior was supposed to be a thing of the past. This isn't over, Mark thought, feeling a growing resolve within him. He looked at the driver through the rearview mirror and knew one thing. This incident would be the start of change. After getting off at the nearest stop, Mark firmly decided that this humiliation would not go unanswered. He wasn't one to turn a blind eye to injustice, especially when it affected him personally. He knew that this driver had to face the consequences of his actions, not because Mark owned the company, but because such behavior towards people was unacceptable in any society. Mark headed straight to his company's office. On the way, he tried to calm his thoughts, regaining his composure. He remembered conversations with his father, who had taught him patience and resilience in the face of racial discrimination. But today, Mark decided he wouldn't just endure. The time for silence was over, and now he could take a step that would impact not just one person, but the entire system. When he entered the office, his secretary, Kate, looked up from her paperwork in surprise. "Mr. Harrison, is everything all right?" she asked, noticing the determined look on his face. "Call all the employees to a meeting in the conference room in 10 minutes, Mark replied shortly, heading into his office. 10 minutes later, the entire team had gathered in the room, including the drivers. Tom, the very driver who had humiliated Mark on the bus, sat in the back row, unaware that today's meeting would be about him. Mark slowly stood and faced everyone, his gaze sweeping across each person. "This morning, there was an incident," he began, his voice clear and confident in the silence of the conference room. "One of our drivers denied an elderly man the right to sit in the front seats, based solely on the color of his skin." The room froze. People glanced at each other, unsure where the conversation was headed. Tom, sensing something was wrong, began to squirm in his seat but still didn't realize it was about him. This driver, Mark's eyes fixed on Tom, who went pale, violated not only professional standards but also basic human principles. As the owner of this company, I will not tolerate such treatment of our clients. Tom suddenly realized who that passenger had been, and his face turned white as chalk. He wanted to say something, but the words stuck in his throat. Mark continued, now speaking directly to Tom. You probably didn't know who was in front of you, but that doesn't matter. What matters is how you treated someone based on prejudice alone. I'm willing to give you a chance to make things right. Tomorrow, you'll undergo special training on bias. Either you change your views or you have no place in this company. Tom, swallowing his shame, lowered his head, understanding that his career was hanging by a thread. But deep down, he knew that Mark was being fair. The next morning, Tom arrived at the company office, nervously anticipating the training. His thoughts were in turmoil. On one hand, he felt humiliated by being at the center of the incident, but on the other, he began to realize that his behavior had indeed crossed the line. The training was led by an invited expert who had worked with many companies on issues of racial discrimination and bias. Tom sat in the back row, trying not to draw attention. For the first half hour, he remained silent, still resisting what he saw as a forced lesson. But as the lecturer told stories of people who had faced discrimination, Tom started to understand that these weren't just distant problems. They were situations he had witnessed and possibly participated in. After a break, the Q&A session began, and one employee asked a question that struck a chord with Tom. What if you don't realize you're being discriminatory? How do you know when you're doing something wrong? The expert smiled slightly and replied, The first step is admitting that you may have biases you're not aware of. We all grow up in a society that subtly shapes our perceptions through stereotypes. But the important thing is that bias is not a life sentence. You can acknowledge and change it if you want to. These words seemed to break down Tom's last line of defense. He realized that his behavior the previous day had been exactly that, driven by unconscious stereotypes. He remembered how he had looked at the elderly man, Mark, and hadn't seen a person, only the color of his skin. This realization hit him hard. By the end of the day, Tom felt different. He no longer saw the training as a punishment. Now it was an opportunity to change something within himself. After the session ended, he approached Mark, who was waiting for him at the office entrance. Mr. Harrison, Tom began, his voice trembling. I want to apologize. I realize how wrong I was. I don't justify my actions, but I want to say that this training opened my eyes. Thank you for giving me a chance to make it right. Mark looked at Tom intently, his face calm but with a flicker of satisfaction in his eyes. He nodded and replied, The most important thing is that you've learned from this. We can all make mistakes, but what matters is how we grow from them. We'll see how you handle things from here on. Tom left with the feeling that he had been given a second chance, and now he had a new goal, to prove that he could change. Weeks passed since Tom completed the training, and his colleagues began to notice changes in his behavior. He became more considerate with passengers, avoided harsh comments, and made an effort to help everyone equally. Initially, his co-workers eyed him with suspicion, but gradually they saw that he was genuinely trying to change. However, Mark remained cautious. He needed more than just good manners on the job. One morning, Mark decided to ride one of his buses again, but this time without revealing who he was. That day, Tom was once again the driver. When Mark boarded the bus, he chose a seat up front, carefully observing the driver's reaction. Tom recognized him, hesitated for a moment, and then approached him. "Good morning, sir," he said with a polite smile. "Would you like to sit here? It's good to see you again." Mark looked at Tom. There was no trace of the rudeness and contempt from the first encounter. Tom now spoke with respect, and it wasn't an act. He truly understood his mistake. Mark nodded and took the offered seat, but continued to observe how Tom treated the other passengers. As the bus filled up, Tom offered help to everyone in need. He assisted elderly passengers, answered questions politely, and even greeted a teenager who, based on his appearance, might have previously annoyed Tom. Mark saw how the driver treated everyone equally, without bias, and felt a growing sense of satisfaction that Tom had indeed changed. The turning point came unexpectedly. At one stop, a young black man with a stroller boarded the bus. Without hesitation, Tom helped lift the stroller and then offered a convenient spot where there was more space for the child. The gesture was so natural that Mark knew Tom had truly come a long way from being a prejudiced man to someone who respected others. When the bus stopped near his office, Mark approached Tom. "You did well, Tom," Mark said, patting him on the shoulder. "I can see that you've changed, and I'm glad I gave you a second chance." Tom exhaled with relief, feeling a huge weight lift from his shoulders. This moment was not just an acknowledgement, but confirmation that his changes had not gone unnoticed. "Thank you, Mr. Harrison," Tom replied with gratitude in his voice. "I've realized that prejudice doesn't make us stronger. It makes us weaker and strips us of our humanity." Mark nodded, feeling a deep sense of satisfaction. He knew that he hadn't just changed one person, but touched something more important: the movement towards equality and justice within his company. This story didn't end with just Mark's victory, but with the triumph of common sense and humanity. Mark not only restored justice, but also gave Tom the opportunity to change and become a better person. Now, they both knew that change was possible if given the chance and supported on the path to correction.